Hello and welcome to Divinely Empowered with Antonia. Today we have Emerald Wilkins, who is a life coach and consciousness work facilitator. She's been using tarot cards for many years to help her do her work and experienced a dark night of the soul, which changed everything. So welcome, Emerald.
Thank you for having me, Antonia.
Thank you so much. So tell us what happened. Tell us all about this dark night of the soul and when everything turned around for you and changed completely.
Sure. Well, I have to start off from what happened before. So to start with childhood, I always had this sense of shame, that I was constantly contending with as a child. It was like a daily struggle of mine. And it was one that I kept secret to myself because I didn't expect that anybody would accept. And I was just too vulnerable to really share. And then at the age of 12, I discovered a new tool came into my toolbox, in order to cope with that shame. And it was a very effective tool for coping with the shame. And that was the ability to create an identity, a positive identity that I could be really proud of. And so it started off with being really proud of being a nice, kind, chilled out person. So that was the first thing, and so I basically, polarized myself over into that. And I basically was a very proud doormat, I was yes, this is because it meant that I was the bigger person. And it's the person in the movies that always it's the underdog. And so I was identifying with that. And then I added other things to the identity. So from the age of 12 to the age of 16, I was accumulating a lot of different things to my identity. And when I was 16, this new potential arose where I could start to identify with my ethical framework, which was still somewhat there, when I was identifying with being this kind, chilled out person. But then I could also identify with my work ethic and with success. And what ended up happening is I ended up, because I had this shame, basically kind of whittling my personality down so narrow into there were very, very few things that I could do, in it without undermining my own identity. So it's I had so many different stipulations in order to maintain my sense of self. And basically, it was almost like this platform that I had built to keep myself up out of the shame, but I was carving that platform narrower and narrower. And it was harder and harder to maintain my identity because my identity was that I never fail. Eventually it became I never fail. I always succeed. I can always do the hard thing. Basically it's never faltering. And so it became this situation where it was almost like I was running on this floating log. And it's I kept upping the ante and upping the ante and upping the ante on myself by carving the ground out from underneath my identity. And then when I was 20 years old, during this time, let's say in June, I had my first plant medicine experience with ayahuasca. It was done not for any spiritual reason. I wasn't attuned to anything spiritual at the time. It was just purely recreational. And then
that's not the sort of thing you take recreationally, let me tell you.
Exactly. Yeah. that's me not knowing, and then basically over the course of the next 5 months, basically things in my life started to just almost synchronistically start falling apart, where all of a sudden I wasn't able to overcome. So part of my identity was no matter how much chaos is thrown at me, I can still succeed. And
Mother Ayahuasca got you good, didn't she?
Grandmother it did. Oh, big time. Yeah. And so it's over the course of that few months after that, all the chaos was being thrown at me. And it's it just instead of it being at a 3 out of 10 chaos, it went up to a 7 out of 10 chaos. And then everything started falling apart. And I wasn't able to maintain my identity of being the person that could always succeed under pressure and being the person that could always show up in accordance with my own values and, this type of thing. And it plunged me right down into that shame that I had in childhood. And it was this sense of in order to be a valid person, I have to do these values perfectly. And if I ever make a mistake, it leaves this black mark on me. Now, in those ayahuasca experiences, these were beautiful experiences. I experienced a transcendence of my self-concept, and I was able to see how all of the all of the things that I was identifying with were just thoughts, you know? So it's like, you know, if I was identifying myself with hard work, it's like, okay, that's just a thought. And I was able to basically reconnect with so many of those cutaway aspects of myself because I had been constantly basically pushing things into the shadow. Like that was my whole MO. It's like I had this deep shame. And so it's like, okay, how do I build this positive identity and like avoid all of these parts? And during these experiences, it was like I was whole again. And I could feel this unconditional love because the whole time I was building this identity, I thought I was doing a profoundly like self-loving thing, almost building myself as a masterpiece. But it's like it opened my eyes to the fact that I was like carving into myself and doing this kind of self-violence. And so it flipped
That's
my
1,000 cuts, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. So it flipped my perspective from like I'm creating myself as an art piece to I'm mutilating myself every single day because I'm trying to make myself perfect. I'm trying to, you know, slice and dice myself and cut away all these parts. And these experiences, like the first one that I had, it's like it got me in touch with like this like childlike joy. And it turned my whole worldview on its ear. So like my worldview had been, you know, somewhat of like a like let's say it's anti-religious kind of worldview. So I had a really strong like, you know, allergy to religion because I found that, you know, I kind of dressed like a goth kid, you know, when I was in high school.
We
And a
were
lot
all
of
goth kids, darling.
exactly. Yeah. But like I would get a lot of negative attention from like kids who were, you know, I don't necessarily know if they were super religious, but they would come from like, ooh, you're a Satanist, you're this, you're that. And so I kind of had disliked, I very much disliked you know, religion because I could see it. I could see the negative elements of it. And so I had this aversion to that. And I wanted to be atheist, but I was really agnostic. And so it's okay, I'm pretty sure there's not a guy up in the clouds there, but maybe there is, you know, so I could kind of keep it like almost see that divine element like behind all of like reality. And I felt this deep sense of oneness, and then that's like was the source of unconditional love. And I'm like, oh, that's what it's about, you know. It's not a guy in the clouds, it's this, you know. And so it was like that flipped my worldview on its ear. And then my whole entire life I had understood the purpose of my life as proving my validity, proving my existential validity through achievement and through being good at this or being good at that. And so it was like life was like one big competition before, which is simple but very hard. Whereas like it's like opened up to this new paradigm where I'm already 100% valuable and valid as I am. And in these experiences, I could feel this unconditional love and oneness. But it's like I didn't know how to function with that. And then it's like I had all of these things fall apart. I had, you know, I really lost every connection in my life other than just one, like my friend Asha, who I was like, you know, I would stay with on and she was like the only person in my life. But I lost my boyfriend who was really chaotic. And so he gave me plenty of grist for the mill to like, you know, prove that I can be successful in chaos, you know. So I lost him. And
I've
then
had one of them.
yeah, lost like connection to like my whole entire group. I wasn't really in touch with my mom or my dad. And, you know, it was at a time where I was basically making my money like busking, you know. So I live in St. Augustine. I was going to college in St. Augustine there. And in the main downtown historic district, you could go out there and you could, you know, play your guitar. And that was the way that I was like making money. And it was a really, really difficult time because I lost all the connections. It was like I was like all alone in the world. And sometimes I'd be walking home at like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and I would think, wow, if somebody like came up and snatched me away, like, you know, it'd be weeks before anybody even noticed. And so there was this sense of like profound isolation in this experience. And in and around, I'm kind of mixing up the timeline a little bit. Before all of that was going on, I had my second ayahuasca experience. And it was because I had failed everything. I was like getting evicted from the place that I was living because we weren't able to pay the thing because my chaotic boyfriend, the situation had like, messed me up there. And then it was like, my grades were dropping. So I was like, okay, I can always get A's. And then my grades, it's like that quarter, my grades, I had one grade that dropped down to a C, which was like unheard of for me. And like, it was like it was like, oh no, now I've got that black mark on me that it's like even a small thing like that can, create the black mark. And now I'm fundamentally, just
Flawed.
invalid as a person. Yeah. And during that time, I also did the ayahuasca, and it was, again, the transcendence of my self-concept. And then I could recognize, and it gave me this insight around, like, I am fundamentally, no matter what, cradled by the universe, like the sense of 100% connected. And it showed me, like, let's say, my good side and my evil side. And so it was like, I was very attached to the idea of goodness because that was the way that I was creating my identity, so I was very, very attached to the parts of me that were good. But it basically allowed me to zoom out and recognize that there are two warring elements that are fairly impersonal to me, that are constantly playing out in my psyche, one that's a more productive drive and one that's a more destructive drive. And each one of these are producing a variety of different urges and thoughts and things like that. So the part of me that was attached with goodness, like that part, like the good part was like wanted everything to have a happy ending and wanted everything to be good and wanted everything to turn out like just perfectly, no suffering. And then the other part of me was like, it had like this almost like glee at suffering kind of thing. And it was like interesting to see that from this space of not being identified with my ego, because if I would have seen this, if I were identified with my ego, it'd be like, oh no, I'm a bad. But I could just watch this dynamic play out, and it didn't mean anything about me. And so fundamentally, I think my deepest shame has been this fear that I'm bad. And that's like where a lot of the shame element has come up for me in childhood. And so being able to see that and get that distance, it was like, oh, actually, this is just an impersonal happening, in the same way that the tree in my backyard doesn't mean anything about my identity. These things going on in the internal universe are also fairly impersonal and don't mean anything about my identity if I don't attach to them. And so there was a sense of detaching from the identity of goodness. And so I had these experiences, and over the course of the few months afterward, my whole entire life flipped 180. And I met my husband a few months later, and then, very shortly after, we were pregnant, and then I became a mom, and it was like just this real, my life did this like 180, but I didn't have any way of squaring, I didn't know how to understand. So I had this, practical world that I had to exist in, where there's better and worse, and like, you have to be motivated to do certain things, and I had been using my own shame to motivate me for years, and so I didn't have any other motor than shame to motivate myself. And so I had to contend with these two paradigms. One is this more, like, let's say, transcendent paradigm, this more spiritual paradigm where everything is one and everything is already perfect, and there is this self-love. And I recognized in these experiences that that's what I had been looking for my whole entire life. The whole time I had been creating all these identities, of like, oh, I'm this person, I'm that type of person. All of that was my way of begging the world, please love me. And then I had not what it was that I wanted. And now it's like I recognize that all of those things I was doing before felt in opposition to the thing that I wanted, which was unconditional love and acceptance, and so what I did is I took the experience and I didn't know how to integrate it. And so it's like, okay, well, if there's all oneness, then I can't have any boundaries. And so I need to seek to be boundaryless. And of course, because we live in a world of separation, it's not going to work. It's like, what's to stop you from walking out in traffic? If you're like, okay, let's go be one with a volcano, see how that works out.
We're not quite there yet.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was needing to recognize that, like, even though these like spiritual truths were more like, let's say, true in the absolute sense, but that still didn't negate more practical truths. And so I had to learn how to build my paradigm out so that I could switch between paradigms, and I could understand that, okay, from the standpoint of the absolute, everything is one, everything is perfect. And on the level of being, there is nothing that I need to do or not do in order to be lovable. But in the practical, like, just kind of like day-to-day reality, I have to do the things that are going to lead to a life that I can feel good about, And so I spent many years trying to like almost fight having an ego. And I would like do things like even for a while to specifically try to embarrass myself, to try to break down my ego, because I just realized that, oh, this is the thing that's getting in the way of what I really, really want, which is the unconditional love, the acceptance. But I was going about it in all this wrong way. And so for a few years, it was almost like I had I had rowed my way up this paddle of these really treacherous waters. And then it's like I realized, oh no, my paddle is bad, which it wasn't bad. It was like just a misunderstanding. My paddle is bad. And so I would throw away every tool that I could potentially use to make my life better, because I'm like, I can't be focused on betterment of life because that's the mistake that I was making before. And it's like I really ended up making myself quite small, and I really went down deep into that shame because I wouldn't let myself create that identity or that platform to keep myself up out of the shame from childhood. And so I spent quite a few years just kind of down in that shame, and that was my dark night of the soul experiences. Even though those medicine journey experiences were very, very beautiful, it's like being down in that negative emotional state, like, and not letting myself actually build myself in a positive direction, which had been my MO for my whole entire life. And that was quite difficult. And then when I was about 23, so 3 years later, that's when I found Jungian psychology. And I started to be able to practically put in place some of the things that I had experienced. And so that was my first little step out of the chaos of that experience. And then from there, I found a variety of different teachers over the course of the next year or two that basically allowed me to kind of build out a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about things, where I could switch between these perspectives and be able to recognize that, I also, in the relative sense, have to be very kind to myself and very loving to myself, self-love, because I'm being very harsh. So that's kind of in a nutshell the whole experience around my dark night of the soul. Yes, so that would be kind of the general.
So how's your shame now? Has it gone completely, or do you cope with it in ways? What do you do with shame?
It's not gone completely. So I actually, like, I've worked through a lot of elements of it, and it's a lot easier for me to do things just for myself, and to feel that sense of self-love. And so what I would say is that it's night and day from where it was before. But it's like there's still elements. And in fact, I do a medicine journey once per year now at an Ayahuasca church. And I actually have one coming up tomorrow, funny enough. So tomorrow is my yearly medicine journey. And so this time around, it's about, let's say I want to forgive my mom. And so I've pushed away many aspects of myself that I've considered like my mom. And so these parts of myself, there's still an element of shame. And so my consciousness hasn't touched these elements in quite some time, because they're from like a long time ago, so like, let's say early childhood and that sort of thing. And so I think that this will really, turn the needle in some ways if I'm able to get what I want from this medicine journey. But there's still elements of myself that there's shame. So it kind of tends to work in a spiral where it's like you get to deeper and deeper levels of it and that sort of thing.
I can delete shame. Would
How's
you like
that?
to try? I can do it. I can tell you what I do. I'm not sure if you've seen some of my stuff, because I do a lot of healing, and I could do, if you're up for it, and for the audience as well. So what I do is I can delete emotions. I figured out, I'm a wizard, and I've spent many years learning how to delete emotions. I've been doing this for a long time. So all I would do is ask you or the audience to focus on whatever is making them feel ashamed, and then to grade it from a 1 to a 10. And I can completely neutralize the shame in your system right now. Do you want to do it?
Sure. Yeah, we can do that.
Should we do it? Why not? And then anyone who's following on at home and watching this, then you can also have your shame deleted right here, right now. Why not? Since that's what I do and you've still got it stuck, we may as well have a little experiment. And this is what I do all the time though. So it's quite fun. And it's normally pretty shifting. So if you close your eyes, and because what I'm going to get you to do is think about anything which is shame related, same for anyone who's watching this later. So just think of any shame that you have. And so you play like a movie montage, all the different scenes of shame. And I'm going to delete all the energy which is holding that in place. And so you'll think of the scenes at the end, they'll feel completely neutral, like something that happened to you, but peaceful without any emotions or anything coming up. People sometimes mistake it for being numb, but it's not numb. What it is emptiness. Peace is emptiness. There's just nothing happening. So if you were going to grade your shame out of 10, maybe give yourself a second to sort of tune in. What would you give yourself out of 10 for your shame right now?
Let's say maybe at a 4.
4 out of 10. Okay. And if you're, so just close your eyes and start thinking about this situation, but still you have shame related to, and we'll delete that. All right. And anyone following at home, do the same. Okay, let's have a little check-in. How's your shame feeling now? Is it still a 4? Has it gone down? Where are you now?
Well, it's I guess it's difficult to tell. Like a lot of my shame is like mostly unconscious on like a typical basis. So like it's like right now I don't like so basically in my day-to-day life, it's like, usually my shame is like, kind of underneath the surface. So it's difficult for me to tell. But I'll have
Can
to
you
like
find it? So can you find it? So before you could find it and you were calling it a 4. Can you find it now?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So basically, I suppose I relate it to, let's say, feelings in my chest and in my throat and things like that. And I guess, you know, I'm not entirely sure. So I guess.
Think about a specific situation which was triggering, and then when you think about it, you feel shame. So think about one of those situations that we covered and see if that specific situation still brings shame when you think about it.
Gotcha. Let's see. Yeah, it's hard to crack into.
It might be because it's gone. That might be why it's hard to crack into, because like a minute ago you were thinking about it and you were feeling shame. Normally the shame is gone. So when you think about it, nothing happens because it's empty. So that might be why you're struggling to find it, because it doesn't exist anymore.
Gotcha. It's possible. I would say that, like I said, most of the time it's like my shame is kind of underneath the surface on like a day-to-day thing. And so I'll have to kind of see how it impacts me like throughout, let's say.
Think about a situation which like 2 minutes ago would have caused you shame. So give yourself a minute to tune into a particularly troubling situation. Can't find it.
No. Yeah.
That's the point. It's gone.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So yeah, that you can just get, I use the work that I've been doing, I based it initially on plant medicines and the way that they work. But the way that you do with plant medicine, sometimes you can, grandmother ayahuasca sort of does what she wants to do. So she, you may go in with a particular plan to be working with a particular situation or emotion or whatever it is. And she does what she thinks is the most appropriate thing that she wants to do. And sometimes it's nothing to do with what you want. That's one of the joys of these plant medicines. And what I do is it's more focused and we have control over what we actually work on. But I just literally, what happens is the emotions or energy in motion just gets stuck in our energetic field around particular memories, and I literally just delete that energy. And then when you think back to the memory is just benign. There's no charge to it. It's just factual as opposed to all those emotions of whatever it might be coming up. So that's what we've just done to you. So it's sort of using hypnotherapy or plant medicine wisdom and then sort of adapting it to a modern specific way.
That makes sense.
It's pretty useful. It's pretty fun. And it helps with a lot of different things. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, back to you. I'm interviewing you. Okay, cool. So your dark night of the soul, and then you've become a completely transcended, different person. And then now you're helping normies to learn what it is to sort of be more at oneness. Is that what you're doing?
I would say it's more like, let's say, the way that it's come through for me in my medicine journeys is that it showed me in, let's say, because back in 2020, I'd done my first, after 10 years of not doing any plant medicine at all, I'd done my first, sitting at an Ayahuasca church. And basically at the Ayahuasca church, I went into this journey where I went through this death experience. And I came in with the question of, okay, is it meant to be that I seek enlightenment, or am I meant to anchor myself, and embody myself fully as Emerald? And I went through this experience of ego death, so before I'd had experiences of transcending my self-concept, which gave me that sense of oneness. The ego death experience was more like there was just pure emptiness and pure nothingness. And from there was sort of, Emerald wasn't there anymore because Emerald had died, but it's like the consciousness took in that, oh, wait a second. It's like, here's like this is what enlightenment is. And it's almost like in the movie, The Lord of the Rings, let's say, to give kind of a metaphor, Gandalf fights the Balrog and he falls out of time and space, and he's away for an eternity, but it's really just the next day that, people see him and they're like, oh, it's Gandalf. And it's like, oh yeah, Gandalf. That is what they used to call me. And so Gandalf had basically gone through this equivalent of this ego death, because I was out of time and space, and or not me, but my consciousness, but not specifically tied to Emerald, and all of reality had been revealed as this illusion. And what had happened is it's almost like I realized that, oh, I'm Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, but nothing that Gandalf ever does, even if Gandalf gets enlightened, within the scope of the story of The Lord of the Rings, it's, he's still going to fundamentally be a story character. And in the same way that I am a character in the story of, let's say, what the Buddhists call the Maya, so it's like, there's nothing that's ever going to make Emerald not an illusion. And so there was this pure experience of nothingness. And, it was the sense that there was no reality, there was no Emerald. And it was it was just a realization that, oh, this is what that is, and then what happened from that experience, and it wasn't so linear. So I don't know what happened first or second, or even if that concept, fits, because I'm trying to interpret this of my human mind, trying to remember back to, things that really don't make any sense to the human mind. So basically at that point in time, there was this infinite awareness that had arisen, so it was the sense of, if you could imagine, you take the human intellect and you multiply that many times over by an amount of multipliers, you exponentially increase it and continue exponentially increasing it. And so it was my intellect as a human being would be just a small candle flame to a huge, infinitely burning forest fire, and so it was this intense knowing, and it was knowing all things, and basically all things that had ever existed, will exist, and currently exist right now. And it was, taking in all of these things and experiencing infinite amounts of joy, infinite amounts of suffering, infinite amounts of everything that might arise within the Maya, within, any kind of, all worlds, all dimensions, this type of thing. And then there was also this infinite heart, infinite love. And this wasn't a visual experience. I wasn't taking it in as a sensory thing. There was still just nothing there, but it was just, this nothingness was like full of this. And basically this like infinite heart was coming to love and experience, the love for all things. And that meant that it was grieving all the griefs. And so when bad things would happen, or, let's say one of the elements of that it would love, would experience suffering, it would experience the grief deeper. And let's say if somebody's relative passed away, and it's like they were really close to that person, and the level of grief that individual person would experience, multiply that in an exponential way infinitely. And it was grieving every grief that was happening, suffering every suffering that was happening. And I had gone through and I'm saying but it's Emerald wasn't there. It was just this point of consciousness within this whole scope of consciousness. And every time it would experience suffering, it would try to surrender to the suffering that was there. But eventually it got to a point where it's like, okay, no, I can't accept this. And so at that point, that consciousness started to split off from the whole of the infinite consciousness. And the other parts of the infinite consciousness would wrap around it in each of these rounds of dealing with the infinite suffering. And it would try to alleviate the suffering for it. But then, of course, because it's infinite, suffering has to re-arise. And over time of experiencing this, or time, there wasn't really time, but it's like this infinite consciousness, out of mercy to itself, decided to create a finite form, and it's like that's when Emerald started to be re-remembered. So Emerald had died, and then Emerald started to be re-remembered, and it was like, okay, hang on a second, this point of can't hold space for this, this infinite awareness of suffering. And so out of this resistance to suffering, and out of a desire to create mercy for itself, it put me into this form. And then I was reborn back into the ceremony. It was a wild experience,
Yeah, as well. Did you experience infinite joy as well, or was it mostly the suffering?
It was hard for this point of consciousness to experience the joy while the suffering existed. And so what it did is it put that point of consciousness into, let's say, this life. And as a child, I was pretty good at staying with the joy and being, basically it showed me my life purpose is mercy, fundamentally mercy toward myself, so that it's almost like this point of consciousness could get its vacation from the infinite. And so embracing limitation, embracing the simple pleasures of life, instead of trying to be Gandalf, trying to be more like the hobbits, so having a lot of enjoyment.
Gandalf, me.
Absolutely. But I've deviated in many ways from this, because I also have this, let's say, sense of resistance. And so it's come out with I need to help other people. I need to help other people. And that is part of it. It also showed me that I can play this role for other people. And it's given me certain gifts and certain experiences to be able to help other people get to mercy. And so it's not so much in and around my life purpose. So there's the soul's purpose, which is to, give, let's say, myself a break from the infinite, it's mercy, and to give myself a break from the infinite thing, or let's say this consciousness a break from the infinite thing, so that it can embrace limitation, and it can embrace mercy. But then it also showed me that on the life's purpose level, that it's almost like, let's say if you have, let's say, a community, and then you have the person who sort of straddles one foot in the community and one foot in other things. So one foot in the community, one foot in the divine, one foot in the community, one foot in the shadow, one foot in the community, one foot in the wilderness. And it's like, it was showing me that there's a certain level of burden to take on with this, and that not everyone's life path is to take on this burden, but that it gave me this gift because it's something that I really wanted. It wasn't something I earned, but it was just because I wanted it. And it showed me that, there has to be somebody who plays that role, so that people can come to that person. And then it's like, if I think about the things that I can provide a person, it's almost like I have to hold, it's like a 500-pound weight, let's say. And let's say I've been given the experiences and the gifts to be able to hold that weight. And then when a person comes to me, I have to be like, okay, this person needs this 5 pounds. And that's what they, that's where they're at right now. Or, okay, this 10 pounds, this person has to carry that. Or like sometimes it'll be like, okay, this person needs to carry 50 pounds. And the way that I would say it is almost like being a person that people within the community can come to and can kind of say, okay, here's what I'm going through on my path. And then I can take my experiences and those gifts and sort of help them find their mercy. And so what my life purpose is to help people find mercy, not necessarily around transcending, so what I found is that my mercy was actually in embodiment. Even though I've had transcendence experiences, it's like, it's really about embodying this life and being this person. And so it's being able to tailor it to where that person is. And so mercy for one person might look like, oh, can I help them get the job that they're wanting to get? Something very simple like that. Or it could be mercy for another person is found in, going on, like some path of enlightenment, or it might be mercy for another person is finding the relationship, they want to find. And so that's what I bring to my coaching there.
What would you say the difference between kindness and mercy is?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's say mercy, it's almost like it's the other side of suffering, so mercy is it's more of like the feeling state itself. So mercy is basically relief, so it's like you have suffering, something's creating suffering. And then when you experience mercy from it, there's relief. And so let's say relief could look like, like, oh, you have a headache and you take an aspirin or something like that,
Sure.
So relief is more general. Now, kindness can be mercy bringing, but it can also, like, if there's too much kindness, so let's say there's in the tree of life, there's like a polarity. So there's mercy on one side of the polarity, and then there's suffering on the other side of the polarity, or not suffering, but what is it called? Severity. Yeah, that's what I was reaching for. So there's mercy and severity. And so the idea is that if you're 100% severity, of course, it's like that's going to be really bring a lot of suffering, because it's like, it's all harshness and tyranny and things like that. But if you're all 100% mercy, then it's going to be the case that the forces of severity will take over, because you won't be able to create any of those boundary lines. And so like mercy and suffering really go hand in hand. They're two sides of like the yin yang. And so kindness, it's a method for maybe being able to provide mercy for somebody, potentially in certain circumstances, though not 100% of the time, because if there's too much kindness, then
but there's kindness and there's niceness. I think being nice is not necessarily, that's boundless, they're boundaryless. I think kindness can have boundaries, and sometimes, you have to be cruel to be kind. Kindness isn't always the nicest thing you could do.
That makes sense.
It's the kindest thing you could do. So I think people get muddled between nice and kind. Well, this is the way that I see it. And that certainly kindness is sometimes saying, maybe you should, I don't know, maybe you should break up with them or something like that when they don't want to hear it, and having that conversation that, people don't always want to hear. The nice might be not to tell someone that their boyfriend's cheating, and the kind thing would be to have that horrible conversation and to actually have some, have a difficult conversation when you possibly wouldn't. But it might be nice just to say, no, everything's fine, just to try and keep the peace whilst but really creating more turmoil. So for me, kindness isn't always fun or nice. So
absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Yeah, so it's like niceness isn't always, going to lead to the
niceness is wishy-washy, and it's boundaryless, and it's, sometimes you can be so. I think you were saying in the beginning that you were very nice when you were, just being everything for everyone, and really, and a lot of mothers have this as well. I know that that's one of the problems that can happen with motherhood, that you just have no time for yourself because you just try to do everything for everyone to be the amazing, to be an amazing mother and be very nice. But sometimes you need to step away so that you can be kind to yourself, so that you don't get completely run ragged because you can't pour from an empty pot.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, most definitely. Yeah. And so like actually like very unkind to oneself to be too nice, for sure.
True. Exactly. Nice. Wonderful. So what else are you up to then?
Let's see. Well, like I said, right now I do have this like medicine journey coming up. I find that in recent days, like a lot of synchronicities have been coming up in and around, let's say, just things that I hadn't made connections with before. And so that's been something of a focus of mine. Otherwise, I've been, let's say, posting, let's say, on YouTube again. And like I've been, posting more on, let's say, I just started posting on Instagram and TikTok, trying to spread myself out a little bit more and, kind of put myself out there. So that's just generally like, what's kind of going on with my life right now as it pertains to kind of my channel and with my inner work process.
And do you have any events coming up?
Mm-hmm. I don't have any events coming up specifically. I do have, let's say, something that I can offer that's like a freebie, So I have, yeah. So basically, let's say it's all about emotional mastery. So it's for highly sensitive people who want to feel more comfortable in their own skin and feel more comfortable being authentic, without suppressing their emotions, which is like the main important thing. And so that's like, if somebody wants to access that freebie, they can go to emotionalmastery.org. And
we'll
so
put it in the description below.
Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Emotionalmastery.org. Yeah. And
yeah, and so like I recommend checking that out. So it's just like about an hour long, or maybe a little bit more than an hour long, and so it gives a lot of good information there. If someone wants to learn more about shadow work, they can go to shadowintegration.org, and I have also a freebie there. So if someone wants to check out my freebies, those are some places they can go.
And so how would you describe shadow work then? Before, that's another big question. I just thought, oh, that's quite a good one to get our teeth into a bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when it comes to shadow integration, so one of the things is that, okay, so whenever it's a case that we are, let's say, first moving through the world, like as children, we tend to come into a place where we are already kind of like, we have all of the elements of our personality that are sort of whole. And then over the time, when we experience traumas, when we experience unmet needs, when we make decisions about our worldview and about our identity, we end up pushing elements of ourself away into the shadow. So basically the shadow is more like, a lot of times people will think about like the shadow is like, oh, it's this mysterious, like dark other self. But in reality, the shadow is more like a place in the psyche where it, almost like a blind spot where we put parts of ourself that we want to forget about. And so when it comes to, let's say, if I have the experience that, let's say I'm a naturally creative person, and I'm raised in a family and in a community that really looks down on creativity. If I have also taken on their viewpoint about that, and I've taken on this worldview that, oh, creativity is stupid, then I'm going to cut that part of myself away and I'm going to push it into the shadow. When these parts of ourselves go into the shadow, they are still very much us. And it's not like you can repress one specific like quality and it's like, okay, I'm just going to get rid of my creativity and then nothing else will go with it. It's really a whole personality fragment that when it becomes
more and more,
absolutely. Yeah. And so it's a whole personality fragment that it's almost like its own mini personality that has its own wants and needs and perspectives and agenda and wisdom and memories that oftentimes can function very differently than the conscious personality. So that's a part of ourself that we call me or I, the things in our identity that we really are conscious of and that we identify with as being part of ourself. These other parts tend to function underneath the surface of consciousness. And so we can become a little bit like a vehicle with many steering wheels. And so if we can think about our conscious personality in like the driver's seat, and let's say we're going and we're trying to make a right turn, let's say, there are elements of ourself that are back in the trunk and they have their own secret steering wheels and they're trying to push us in other directions, and so we can often
self-sabotaging.
Absolutely end up with self-sabotage. When these parts of ourself are underneath the surface of consciousness, they can operate basically in ways that bring us back through patterns that we don't want to be in. And they can bring us into, situations that basically trigger up, let's say if they were repressed due to some kind of trauma, the same kind of situation over and over again in hopes of, let's say, getting a different result than what was last time. So for example, if I have a shadow aspect that was repressed because it had unmet needs for validation from my family, let's say, and I might end up in relationships with people who, let's say, aren't able to be validating or are specifically invalidating because it matches same pattern, and that part is trying to re-engage that same pattern to try to get a different result. Like, okay, it didn't work here, but maybe with this person who can't validate me, I'm going to convince them to validate me. And then usually it's like repeating the same things over and over again, which is why Carl Jung, who was the person who coined the term shadow and everything, he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. And so those are those secret aspects, you know, steering the car from back in the trunk, and they'll try to bring us back through the same patterns over and over again. So when it comes to shadow work is the process of actually going in and shining light on those parts that are unconscious and being able to understand them at very, very deep levels and get more emotional proximity with those parts. So if I have an aspect of myself that's repressed because it's experienced shame, it's like, how deeply can I experience that shame and like be with that part of myself and accept that part of myself without trying to change it, you know? Or, you know, basically if I have an aspect that needs validation, so there's an unmet need for validation, that's why it was repressed, then how can I as the conscious personality actually give this part that validation instead of trying to seek it outwardly from other people and bring myself back through those patterns? And so that's kind of what shadow work is in a nutshell.
Amazing. Wonderful. That's really informative. Thank you. Okay, so Emerald, thank you very much for being here. Do you have any final words of wisdom for our audiences?
Sure. Well, one of the things with shadow work is that it's important to recognize that if we, let's say, look at ourselves or look at others like deep down, that one of the things I've actually witnessed this in my medicine experiences is that everything roots down to something innocent and benevolent, and it's basically all going to be very self-interested and self-loving as well. So if we have a part of ourself that, let's say, is trying to steer our vehicle in a direction that feels very, very negative and like something that we wouldn't want to do, like maybe we're engaged in some kind of addiction or we get into these bad relationship patterns, that we want to look for what is the inherent, let's say, self-interested, benevolent motive there. Try to ask, like, how am I trying to serve myself through doing these things? Or how is another person trying to serve themselves through doing those things? And, you know, it's basically just because they don't interpret me, you know, if they're doing it against me, they're not interpreting me as part of themselves, that they're thinking they can do something at my expense for this reason. So it's being able to exercise compassion toward other people by realizing there are fundamentally innocent, benevolent, self-interested motives underneath everything. And because everything is one, everything is self. And so there's, you know, anytime you see a person acting in a less than loving way, including oneself, you know, that it always comes down to that fundamental, innocent, self-interested, benevolent motive.
Interesting. Wow, what a lovely interview. Well, thank you, Emerald, for being here on my channel, Divinely Empowered, and I hope to speak with you again soon.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. All right. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye. See ya.